So hello again and welcome to another McRider's Diaries Urban Jungle Test. In this series of videos I ride motorcycles in the city, on regular roads and commutes, rain or shine, just to see how well a high performance bike actually copes with the real world. And today is the day I get to ride a particular motorcycle, one I've been itching to get my hands on for a long time. And this bike is the Ducati Hypermotard 698 Mono. According to Ducati, this is the most sophisticated, highest performance single-cylinder motorcycle in the world. With this Hypermotard 698 Mono, I'm just going to call it the Hyper Mono from now on. So with the Hyper Mono, Ducati have taken basically all the knowledge and expertise they've learned from years of superbike racing, from racing the 1199 and 1299 Panigale, and taken all that wisdom to create a very special single-cylinder motorcycle. The engine of the Hypermono is basically the 1299 Panigale Super Quadro unit with one cylinder removed. It's basically half a Panigale. Even the cylinder bore size of 116mm, that remains untouched. But the Hypermono cylinder gets a slightly longer stroke, which explains why its capacity is just a little more than half of the 1299. And by the way, the Hypermono is technically a 659cc, even though Ducati call it a 698. But anyway, that's not so important. What is important is that this, to all intents and purposes, is a single-cylinder Panigale. You could even call it a Panigale Mono. I don't know about you, but when I think of lightweight single-cylinder Ducatis, I think of the legendary Super Mono. That's the limited edition track-only single-cylinder bike engineered and designed by Massimo Bordi and Pietro Blanche way back in the early 90s, I think. So why? Why on earth did Ducati develop this road racing derived engine and then put it in a supermotard frame? On paper, supermotards have a very narrow performance envelope. They're built to go around a go-kart track very quickly. But more than a missile around a tight circuit, Ducati actually claim the Hypermono is also a fun bike for the street. So that's why we are here, to see how fun the Hypermono is in traffic. The initial impressions are good though. I'm definitely feeling comfortable aboard the bike. The riding position is quite neutral, upright with a good view of the road ahead. The bars are wide but not too wide. The seat is firm and thin. So far I'm not feeling any discomfort. The bike also feels so narrow and small, and that's always a good thing in the city. It's one of those bikes where you can get on and immediately get up to speed quickly. No sharp learning curve, no familiarization period really necessary. And the most obvious feature about the bike is that it feels extremely light. With a full tank of petrol, the bike weighs in at just 160 kilograms. In comparison, the last really lightweight high-performance motorcycle I rode was an Aprilia RS 660, and that bike was just 180 kilograms weight. And I was really impressed with how light and maneuverable it was. And the Hypermono is actually 23 kilograms lighter. This lack of heft really does have a compounding effect, especially in traffic. The Hypermono is easy to move, easy to maneuver, and very confidence inspiring. Even though it has a somewhat elevated seat height. And by the way, the model we get here in Singapore is the Asian edition, which means seat height is 849mm instead of the standard 904mm. So this 50mm reduction in seat height has been achieved by shorter springs front and rear, as well as a lower seat. And actually, because the seat is so narrow and the rear shocks are softly sprung, it definitely doesn't feel especially tall. At the stop, the lightweight means it's also easy to balance the bike upright with just one foot on the ground. However, higher up, the wide handlebars do limit its lane splitting ability. The bars and lever guards take up quite a bit of horizontal real estate. And to make matters worse, they seem to be located exactly at car mirror height. First gear is quite tall, but the excellent low-speed fueling does help with low-speed maneuvers. The brakes on the 698 are very good, almost too good. The bike uses a massive 330mm brake disc up front, and that's the same size as that used on the Panigale V4. And the bike also comes with 4 levels of ABS. For those who ride in the urban jungle, there's just no getting away from the elephant in the room, and that is engine heat. So is this half Panigale a heat generating beast? Well, to be honest, it runs pretty warm, and I won't be riding the bike in shorts again. But seriously, with its 13.1 to 1 compression ratio, the Super Quadromono engine was always going to generate serious heat. So yes, it does run hot, but it does not overheat. At traffic lights, the fan is running most of the time, and this is ensuring engine temperature stays between 94 and 100 degrees Celsius. Unfortunately, the fan does direct warm air away from the engine and right onto your thighs, especially the right thigh. And that's probably my biggest gripe with the bike. The extraction of hot air at a standstill could definitely be better. But once on the move, even at low speeds, heat is not a problem. Ducati have really pushed the envelope with this engine. It makes 77.5 horsepower from its 660cc engine. And 77 horsepower may not seem like much, but remember, this is a single cylinder, and it's a single cylinder that revs to over 10,000 RPM, and that's a very, very big deal. Matter of fact, no manufacturer has ever produced a road-going single as revvy as this. So the Hypermono actually makes peak power at about 9,750 RPM. But it will actually continue revving to 10,250 RPM. And in contrast, something like the KTM 690 SMC, that tops out at about 8,500 RPM. And that's already a competition-based engine. A traditional single-cylinder workhorse, something like the Yamaha Tenere 660 single, that engine actually peaks at about 6,000 RPM. Right, so in comparison at 6000 RPM, the Hypermono is just getting started. In fact, the Hypermono is actually making more power when revving high than Yamaha's MT-07 parallel twin. The front Mazzocchi 45mm forks seem to be quite firmly set up. At very slow speeds, the steering feels almost heavy. I think there's a fair bit of weight on the front wheel. Due to their geometry, a lot of supermotards can get dangerously unstable at speed. So the trade-off with slightly heavy low-speed steering is that the Hypermotard feels rock solid and very stable at high speed. Ridden more aggressively, the stiffer suspension works as Ducati intended, but for street-only riding, the stock setup might be a little too stiff and deliver a harsh, bumpy ride for most people. But one plus point in terms of the bike's streetability is the electronic riding modes available. There are 4 riding modes: Sport, Road, Urban and Wet. And you access them via buttons on the left handlebar. The system is simple and mostly intuitive. You can even change them while on the move, just as long as you keep the throttle closed for that split second when making that mode change. And I had a good opportunity to try this out yesterday when I rode the bike in the rain. Initially I left the Hypermono in road mode, but this mode actually gives you full power, but with a somewhat smoother throttle response than Sport mode, which is the mode you use on a racetrack or a circuit. But in the rain, even road mode can feel a little too aggressive. Small twists of the throttle still sends way too much power to the rear wheel, and I found it difficult to ride smoothly in the rain. The throttle mostly felt like an on-off switch. So switching to rain mode completely transformed the bike. Power drops from 77.5 to 58 HP, but the throttle response is so much gentler and the electronic aids are on full alert. So a small twist of the wrist results in predictably small and gradual power increments to the rear wheel. And this makes it much easier to ride in the rain, especially accelerating through turns in the wet. But for such a technologically advanced motorcycle, it does have a relatively tiny, no-frills 3.8-inch LCD display. The display does the job of providing all the basic information you need clearly, but nothing more. In terms of servicing and maintenance, Ducati specify a valve check every second oil change. This sounds excessive, but it isn't. Because the oil change interval on this bike is an incredible 15,000 kilometers, which means a valve check every 30 Ks, and with half the valves and no fairings to remove compared to $12.99 Superbike, valve adjustment should be quicker and simpler and cheaper. Riding on the open road, it becomes apparent very quickly the 698 is a very different kind of single-cylinder motorcycle. For one, it's not especially grunty. It doesn't chug and thump like from low revs like the traditional single. To make any sort of forward progress, the gearbox needs to be worked and the bike needs to be revved. You can't just leave it in top gear and simply open the throttle. The Hypermotor actually makes a decent amount of torque, 63 Newton meters if I remember correctly. But maximum torque is available only at about 8,000 RPM. In fact, 80% of maximum torque is available between 4,500 and 10,250 RPM. But still, the Hypermotor is happiest operating in the upper middle rev range. And below 4,000 RPM, there's really not a lot going on. When evaluating a motorcycle's usability, I also like to see if it can be ridden comfortably at street legal speeds, ideally in top gear. Because being able to ride at or below the speed limit for an extended period of time, I think this is a very useful quality to have for a road-going motorcycle. And in our case, this means being able to cruise comfortably and effortlessly between 80 and 90 kilometers an hour on the expressway. It should be able to do this in 6th or at the very least in 5th gear. And if it starts sputtering, lurching and overheating at these speeds, then it's probably better for my license, my safety and my sanity to ride something else. At 80 km/h in 6th, the 698 is doing about 4,000 RPM. And at this engine speed, it's not really in its power band. However, because the bike has excellent, really good low speed fueling, even at small throttle openings, the bike can cruise without complaint. But again, at this engine speed, if I needed to overtake quickly, I'd have to drop a gear, maybe even 2. I'm also noticing some vibration and buzziness at the foot pegs at highway speeds. But this engine does start to smoothen out at about 5,000 RPM. So, is it going to be hard work keeping the Hypermotor at legal speeds on the expressway? Well, you could probably get away with it. The 698 will motor along at 80 k's, especially in light traffic. But it does prefer more aggressive riding, where you're moving up and down the mid-range, where you're constantly accelerating and decelerating. Having said that, it will very happily cruise between 100 and 120 k's all day long. Could you actually tour on this bike? Well, if you really wanted to, and if you were prepared to stay up the highways and make frequent stops, I don't see why not. The main issues: zero wind protection, the seat isn't made for long distance comfort, strapping down luggage could be challenging, and the fuel range is limited by that smallish tank. I think it's about 12 liters. So if you're willing to tolerate and work around these limitations, this could actually be a fun bike to go touring on, especially if your route has lots of turns and hills. Overall, I think if you're determined enough, you could make this bike work in the city, and yes, maybe actually have fun with it. It has a lot of things going for it: comfortable ergonomics, small light package, strong mid-range, phenomenal brakes, and a full suite of electronic rider aids. But it's pricey. Ducati retailed this for about $55,500 on the road. It's pricey for a single cylinder, but you do get Panigale level technology. Imagine that, a Panigale you can actually enjoy on public roads.